everyone, and welcome to my podcast, Don't Get a Therapist Yet. And today I have a very special guest. Her name is Dr. Amber Johnston, and she's a neuropsychologist. And Amber, if you'd like to tell us a little bit more about your role and what you do, because I'm sure people will be very interested in this particular subject.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. Yes, I'm a neuropsychologist, which means that it's a progression within the degree process where I received a clinical psychology doctorate, and then after that went into specialty training to look at the role of the brain. Traditionally, neuropsychology tends to work with people who have had an injury to their brain. So that might be a traumatic event or an accident, or it could be what we call an acquired brain injury. So that's something like a stroke or a cardiovascular incident. And these are things that then will impact a person who survives to be able to then function with a potential damage to a part of their brain. So as a neuropsychologist, what we're doing is we're trying to help that person adapt to life after injury and help them understand what their changes to their behavior, their personality, or their cognition might be following that event, and potentially help guide with a rehabilitation process, which sometimes we can be very successful, or sometimes it's more about adapting to injury that could be potentially life-changing. So that's a role of the traditional neuropsychologist. However, I do want to say that it's always been my passion to be a clinical psychologist and work in therapy. So for me personally, I find it really valuable to use my neuropsychology background to help people understand how a healthy brain is functioning and when it then starts to create some difficulties in their life and where those kind of stuckness and those struggles can be that might have some neuropsychological underpinning.
And that's a really good explanation of where, traditionally this is how a neuropsychologist will work. But I think you're saying that the practice is evolving much more to actually understand more the brain and its function and its impact on the mind and the body. So could you tell us a little bit more about some classic kind of examples of the things that you might be working with?
So I guess if we're thinking more traditionally, if people have had a accident or injury where there has been a significant change to their brain structure, you'll often find people who have memory difficulties, they will have disorientation, they may have physical health symptoms that are related to their brain functioning, not just the physical piece. They will have changes in their behavior and their mood that can happen. And each one of those things are relevant to different parts of the brain that are not working as efficiently as they once did. Now, the brain is something that is incredibly malleable, and the concept of neuroplasticity means that there's always the potential for growing and shaping and changing based on what the environment is providing. We used to think that that only happened early in age, and then there was no further change that happened. And we now have realized that that's not the case. Our brain is constantly shaping and shifting, and it means that lifelong, I've had 91-year-old patients come in and say, how are you going to change me? I'm an old dog, there's no new tricks. And I'm saying there's always room for new tricks. Now, after a more significant event, we can't always fully heal. But what we try and do is look for compensation or ways that with whatever deficit that still is there, we could still find some other ways to function in a similar way, even if it's different than before. So that's a big role of the traditional space. I think you will have seen, your viewers will have seen that throughout social media, there is a real push now to understand things like the chemicals in our brain, to understand how our brain is working that's impacting our emotional well-being. And I think traditionally, a lot of the psychological principles were more about a concept of mind. And it was very abstract, this mind idea. And now we're moving a little bit more into, though that's still very relevant, I think also having some of the structural neurophysiological underpinnings just helps give a little meat to this more kind of abstract idea.
And that is such a good point and so interesting. And I think as a therapist myself, I think it's really interesting to have this sort of role of science coming into therapy. And what I notice is people understand how their brain functions or how their brain connects to their body. They immediately feel more in control and more hopeful as well. And it sounds as though you do this, but you're very specialists or very experts in that role. So could you tell us a little bit more about how perhaps how the brain works and how that impacts on the body? I know that's a very big question to ask you, Amber, but
Sure.
start with how does the brain work and how might it affect body?
I think the number one piece here is that we have, as a society, as a culture, as a medical field, really try to separate this concept of mind and body or brain and body. And we're trying to move now into a new place to understand that everything is very complex. I think that's the point because there is such complexity over the course of, medicine. We've had to get more and more specialized. So, you can't just have a general practitioner. You have to go see the elbow specialist and you have to go see, the urologist, or you have to see the neurologist, and in doing so, we've separated out these pieces of the body to have a real focus on. And I think what ends up happening is that in looking at something so specific, the rest of the symptomology of the person or the person themselves, the whole person gets really lost in that. So we have this disconnect. So I think the first point is that we are all one system. So the brain and body are not disconnected. They are constantly in communication and using information from what we call top down or bottom up processing to be informing everything from what we think, what we feel, how we move, how we behave, what we need. And all of that is keeping us alive. That's survival, the main goal of the whole thing. So one system. And that means that within the brain itself, to answer your question, like what do we need to know? Well, we need to know, first of all, that thinking is very slow. Thinking is a slow process. So we have a huge amount that's happening in the what we call lower areas of the brain that are much more about interpreting, reflecting, and predicting without having to bother our conscious awareness. Our conscious awareness is highly energy deficient. It takes a huge amount of energy to think. And so the more we can be taking in, processing, and moving forward without having to bother our conscious awareness, the more efficient our energy resources are. So that's the number one thing, because I think in the past people would talk about, unconscious processes and this concept that just seems a little, I don't know, out there.
Yeah.
It's hard to understand or grasp or to make sense, and it doesn't feel very scientific. And I think what this is saying is that actually there's a little bit more physiological explanation for what we previously called the subconscious. And it's not quite, it's just that we've learned, our brain is a learning machine. It is learning all the time. And to learn what is needed for the survival of the whole system as it moves through the environment, it's going to be focusing on possible threat and stress, and it's going to be setting us up to do the next thing, which is very habitually based. This is why we get so stuck into habits. They're easy, they're energy efficient. And so when we are thinking about what our brain is trying to do to keep us surviving, it's going to use the information it's had from that is learned previously. And the more that we've done the same thing over and over again, the more easy it is for the brain to just try and access that same pattern. It's some really interesting stuff that you can see where, on imaging, you will find that a person will have the lighting up of the motor area involved with, say, a certain hand or a leg movement before they consciously have thought of trying to move their arm to pick up a cup. And people will say, oh, well, does that mean we don't have free will, or who's really in charge? That kind of thing. And the truth is, all that it is that the brain knows that if it sees a cup over there, there's a good chance you might pick it up and drink from it. It's learned that association. So it just sets up the potential for these movements. Now, at any point, our consciousness can start to override if we need to. If we look and say, oh, that cup's really dirty, we override and we don't necessarily do the habitual way. So we are totally in control. But our brain's going to be setting us up in certain ways. And I think these are kind of some of the concepts that are really important in therapy, because it helps people start to understand, why is it so easy to stay stuck in bad habits? Why are they feeling stressed or threatened by things that they don't even understand necessarily? And is there a role of processing that's happening that they aren't fully in control of? only because, they're feeling like why can't they do the things they know that they should? Why can't they make the changes that they really want to? And some of these kind of physiological processes can help people start to understand there's a bit more going on than they thought of before, but there's a lot we can do about it.
And would it be fair that maybe it's called a reward system? So maybe, like you say, you get into a habit of, I think a classic thing that happens is, when you're young, the parent will feed you. And sometimes that's a very soothing and rewarding process as well. And it's necessary, but that can actually turn into a habit, which is unhelpful. And then you can actually lead to emotional eating. That might be one thing, which would that be like an example of what you're talking about?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the biggest pieces in therapy for me is being really compassionate. Almost every single thing that we do has a function. Everything, even the things that we feel are the most self-destructive, they almost always have a reason that has benefited us in some way. And that could be even just the concept of being able to escape everything, knowing that there will be repercussions down the line. But in the moment, there's always going to be function, and soothing, feeling connected, escape, just trying to come away from feelings of overwhelm or something we can't tolerate. There'll be many behaviors that will either be to do with maybe memories. So yes, things that are associative to a better feeling state, and therefore we want to try and recreate that if we can, particularly if it's quick and easy. The other thing that makes things really quick and easy are chemicals. So the chemical systems that we potentially are hitting. So when we're hitting a dopamine system is all about wanting and seeking a reward. It's a reward-based system. So that's the dopamine system. What people find, which is really interesting, and I'm sure everybody will relate to this, that idea of wanting something. And then as soon as you have it, like suddenly that emotion experience just falls off a cliff. And then often it's replaced by guilt a lot of times. So again, that wanting, just having to have that bag of Doritos, going, enjoying it, but we're not really often enjoying it. We often don't even notice that we're doing it. And then suddenly the bag's empty and quickly dopamine's gone. And instead is that real guilt and shame that follows. But there's other chemicals, that we're always trying to think about what could we be doing to help with chemical management too. And all the chemicals are very, very valuable. Dopamine is there to make sure that we eat and that we reproduce and that we have resources for our survival. We're just in a place now where we don't actually have so much need the way that that chemical used to want to drive us to go off in the hunt and, in the prairie. Now we just have, the pantry. So a bit of there's an evolutionary perspective here where we've advanced as a society much more quickly than our entire body system has, we haven't kept up physiologically with what our needs are now.
And just that understanding and that explanation you can give to a person can be so validating, can't it? Because I think what you're saying is we have like an inborn survival system, and that's very dominant in our kind of in everybody's bodies. We all have a survival system. Every living thing has a survival system, and sometimes that can dominate us. And if you just suddenly understand that, then actually understand your behaviors, and then that's where the compassion can come in, because that's the way we're made, and that's where we're built. Yeah,
that's right.
That's a
But
great.
the important piece is because we've been built that way, it means that it is a challenge, but it doesn't mean that we are just a slave to our own experiences. We do have more agency than that.
Yes, and I think I loved your explanation of how the mind tries to be efficient and sort of saves energy and does things quickly and easily. And I suppose you get into a pattern then as well, like um, a term that I sometimes use is called a neural pathway.
Yes.
And are you okay to tell us a little bit more about your understanding of that? Because I'm sure yours will be much more advanced than my understanding.
Well, I think that like anything, these are all oversimplifications. That's the key. There's oversimplifications, and the bottom line is that the brain is probably the most complex thing in our universe that we can identify at this point. So we don't fully understand. We don't fully. But what we do know is that you can see that there's neuronal activity that gets strengthened over time with repetition. And it also has associations. So the neurons that connect to other neurons means that when you have those pathways, you are more likely to have this kind of chaining effect between one thing bringing up something else. And that's where association, the concept of association, is that you can walk and see your sofa and know that's where you have your Doritos. And so suddenly you walk by and feel this need to want to go get the Doritos. So there's a lot of these kind of associative patterns that happen, but it also can be that you walk into a room and have a feeling, or, you suddenly are, in some particular, a classic one was sleep hygiene. The idea that if you are going to go into your bedroom, you want to have your bedroom set up for having an association with getting ready for calm down and sleep, not for big blue lights and screens and excitement and entertainment. So there's a lot of ways with which we can understand how the brain will be primed to have certain experiences because of these neuronal pathways or associative networks that are there. And again, we do know that there's lots of ability to alter those networks, but they take huge amounts of repetition. And there's new therapies that are coming out that are looking at more ways to open up the likelihood that these neuronal pathways will loosen and make potential new connections, which is very, very interesting stuff. But yeah, I think at the moment is using the understanding of that predictive machine of the brain, how it's trying to be efficient, and how it's looking for previous experiences to navigate what to expect is needed from us next. That's really important with habit change. With habit change, it takes a lot of effort. And the more depleted you are, the more difficult it's going to be to overcome the natural, habit or desire to do the new thing. So again, we try and be really, self-compassionate about that. You keep up the motivation, you keep the motivation here, and there'll be lots of times when you're not able to do it, but you just keep trying and trying and trying.
I think you use a really good word there, depleted. It describes lots of things. Could you perhaps give us a little bit more examples of how a person might become depleted?
Well, depleted is simply the fact that we all live in very, very stressful environments. It's a different type of stress. Again, our body is made to cope with stress. It has a whole sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, which is the stress response and the relaxation response. And they work, in conjunction, one after the other, to turn on the body system to prepare for fight or flight, and to turn it off as soon as that has passed. Now, really, evolutionarily, that was because you would have a fight or flight when, a tiger was in the area, and then it came down when the tiger passed. There was much more of this physiological threat response that we needed to have to physical threat. As society has evolved, and actually, let's also note that with evolution of humans developed the brain capacity to be able to do something that I call time shifting, which is to ruminate about the past or to worry about the future. Again, very, very beneficial. If you are out in, the plains and that there's an area where there's a lion pride, you've remembered that information, you're able to think about what the meaning of that is. You can think about how that might impact in the future, and you can make changes to where you set up your camp in order to be able to deal with that threat. The idea of being able to move and shift and plan and have judgments and make sense of and reason is all advanced cognitive thinking, which is in this frontal lobe of our cortex. The problem is over time, our brain and our bodies, again, one system, they don't necessarily understand the time shift concept. So when we think about something that may or may not happen down the line in the future, we feel it in our body like it's happening now. So how many times have you gone over in your head an unpleasant conversation with a partner or a colleague or a friend, and you felt all of that physical sensation that comes rushing through? It could be a full stress response. Actually, your heart's changing, your stomach digestion is altering, you get tension in your body, in your head, headache, all because of a thought. And that happens in a situation now where our stresses to our existence, to our survival, to our life is all around theoretical and more abstract concepts for the most part. That's not the case. There's a huge population that do still struggle with their physical safety all the time. And that's an unfortunate part of the world we're in. But a lot of the more modern society, you're worried about whether or not your boss likes you and whether or not you're going to pay your mortgage or whether or not you're having a difficult time in your marriage, or if your kids are going to stop being so problematic all the time. And these are the stresses that we're experiencing. There's still too our feelings of safety, being part of a social group, being able to have hierarchy, being able to get our needs met. But there are these things that don't just go away the way that a lion passing by would then settle the system. So our system is being activated again and again and again and again and again. And how psychologically resilient somebody is will help explain how quickly they can come back down and focus on the safety of the present rather than getting caught in the time shifting and this reactivation that keeps happening.
Yeah, that explains it really well, doesn't it? And how you are naturally processed to be sensitive to threat. And that's your survival system again, isn't it? And again, just understanding that, and this is how we're made, and it's okay, can really help a person to sort of understand that. One thing I'm really curious about is if you do have sort of memory problems or cognitive impairment where something has happened, how would you help a person to sort of, you mentioned a little bit about neuroplasticity, how would you help a person to sort of develop that area?
Well, this one is a tricky one. Actually, something I'll mention, which might be a bit more relevant to listeners too, is that what we often find is that there's memory and cognitive changes that can happen also in response to high levels of stress and to mood. So it's very common for people with mood disturbance or a mood diagnosis of depression or high anxieties could also be experiencing attention issues. If they are very focused on the threat or the upset around them, it's really difficult to focus on external stimulation and things. So that means that their attention to those things aren't as strong, so they don't encode as well. So their memory for events that happen feels like it's impaired. So this is a regular thing we see across the general public, not just those that have had difficulties organically. And so some of the ways that we're really thinking about this, now again, we can't guarantee that we can return to previous levels of functioning, but there's lots of ways to think about memory. And memory can be broken down into a few things. So the first is being able to attend to something enough to begin the process of putting it into the memory store. And if we think about the world around us, our world around us is constantly doing things on purpose to get our attention. So we have so much more stimulation around us that is focused on the pure point of taking our attention away from whatever else it needs to be. And there's also a lot more demand that seems to be placed on the general population, so that dividing attention is something that's often required. And we all know that dividing attention, no matter what they say about multitasking, it is not an efficient way to do what needs to get done. So we look at whether or not there's an attention issue, or is it actually storing it into the memory store? Now, there's some ways that we could help people think about it if the storing is the hard part, which means that it could be that actually they need a lot more repetition in order to really get important information in. Or it could mean that they need it in multiple modalities. So instead of just hearing information, it might be really helpful that they're more of a visual encoder. So they need to be able to see it. They need to write it down. They need to have more notes taken. Or it just needs to be done in a couple of times. So you teach people strategies of saying, having a conversation, hearing some information, and then asking to repeat the important information at the end, or even you yourself repeating back what you've just heard as a way to get that repetition in. So those are some strategies. Of course, then you have once it's encoded into memory, is retrieving it from memory. That's another important step. Now that too can be impacted by organic damage. It could be impacted by mood state. It could be impacted by, just again, being off in a million different places and forgetting. We look at whether or not somebody can recognize the information, which means when you're given cues, just little clues, does it kind of jog that memory and help with the retrieval piece? So that's just something about thinking, what kind of clues can we be putting in, or cues? That's just reminders. That's just putting things on your devices that could help jog, or just little cueing or mnemonics or anything like that that helps access that if it's not just freely available to be there. Those are just some of the ideas that we have around how to work with people.
Mm. But they're really good, and what they are is they're actually real practical skills that a person can do. And I think you're talking about a couple of things there. One is the assessment of the problem,
Mhm.
is whether it's sort of like a mood related thing where people's concentration is much worse and attention is much worse, or whether there's something else going on. But it sounds as though you're really good at sort of providing hope for people and saying, look, there are things you can do to improve your memory. There's practical things you can do, and these are just some examples that people can sort of take away and take that on board. So that's a lovely, hopeful memory, whatever the problem is. That's
We hope so. I think the biggest thing that people struggle with is feeling like they aren't what they once were. And that comparison is a really hard piece to manage. But I also see this all the time again in a general population where we have a natural declining in some areas of cognition as we age. And you often see a lot of people worried about the state of their memory or something else with their cognition because they're comparing it to what they once were, as opposed to understanding that, yes, unfortunately, that will get worse for all of us, really. That's part of the natural trajectory. And so a lot of people are asking me, well, what can I do about that? What can I actually do to protect my brain as much as possible? The first thing is to know that though that's one area where there's some declining, we do see that things like vocabulary information is something that improves lifelong. So there are some areas that you do continue to get better in, even though there's some areas that you might start to lose a bit of that. And they
yeah.
say that the problem with doing just too many, like to just do Sudoku or a crossword every day, is that you kind of get really good at doing Sudoku or the crossword, but the generalizability is not necessarily as strong. So what we're looking for is lots of novelty of activity for the brain. And if there's one thing that has kind of the most amount of potential benefit for our brain, it's talking, it's socializing, it is being active in a community, maybe not just with one person where you know what they're going to say, but again, having real interaction and engagement with the community where you don't know what that person's going to say, or you haven't met that person, or you're having new experiences that the brain's having to think about and process using more of the network. And that's going to be more of a protective factor.
When you say those things, Amber, what is so wonderful is we can all do that. We can all talk more. We can all join groups more. We can, whether that's online or in person, that's something we can all do more of, is talk, isn't it? And that's such a amazing pearl of wisdom that is. And that novelty talking and that discussion, that debate is something I think you're talking about. And that's really, really good to hear that.
Well,
And
that's protective of the brain, but we also have all kinds of studies that show that is protective for well-being. The single best thing that predicts well-being is an active social life for
mm,
people throughout their lifespan.
mm. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yes. But knowing that, I think what's really important is there's science behind this as well, isn't it? It's not just us just giving general advice. This is actually very well researched fact, and it actually helps the stimulus of our brain, isn't it? It's about stimulating that sort of interest and that discussion. And I suppose also having interest as well, would you say would be another good thing? There's
Well, I think that starts to be where again we're looking at some of the other chemicals that are involved in the brain. You know, dopamine is in the spotlight at the moment. I think that actually there are some of these other ones, serotonin. We all know that serotonin is a good thing, but serotonin's involved in sleep regulation and memory and learning and pain, you know, in a number of other things besides just feel good mood. And also, serotonin is not just about this kind of heightened spikes that you get with something like dopamine. It's more of this kind of steady contentment. And we can practice that with being grateful, with having, you know, external access to the outside world and being in nature and doing things for our body that, you know, is really helpful in keeping that regulation, if that's eating well or moving our body, just moving it. I don't mean heavy exercise. I just mean move your body more. And social engagement is all part of that connection and feel good and that serotonin. So I think there is something about hobbies which just means being able to feel a sense of interest and contentment and peace and part of, this being an identity that's really valuable. Now, you also get access to some of the other things. Like there's lots of dopamine going on when you're enjoying an activity and working towards a goal. That's very goal-driven and reward-seeking behavior of a preferred activity. And that's a really nice feeling as well. I think novelty is what our brain is looking for. That's a dopamine drive as well. It wants a lot of novelty, but that's something that we know is a feel good, is a well-being piece. To habits are good. We know that with the brain and the predictive machine. We want to get the best habits that we can. We want to have a lot of social engagement, and we want to have novelty seeking as a part of well-being too.
Yeah, and that's really good. And again, that's something that people can work on and notice a difference as well. And I think also I notice if people are sort of engaged in more activities and like you said, there's social connection, there's less time to actually do the ruminating or the worrying that sometimes actually affect our mental health because those sort of tend to have less time for those things as well. So
Yeah,
that's another benefit.
there's something called the default mode network. And that is a series of structures that are in the brain that are connected, that are highly active when you're doing nothing. And the default mode, so when we're doing nothing, when we're staring at a wall, our brain is still highly active in the default mode. And they tend to be thinking about I and me. They tend to be really kind of that reflective thing. And they're actually pretty highly associated with anxiety and depression. Because there is something about getting really stuck in oneself and the time shifting and the ruminating. And of course, normally a lot of self-criticism that goes with that and is connected with the emotion centers. And this is where that default mode network has a correlation with some of these mood symptoms. And that's why they talk so much about the importance of being mindful, which is nothing more than putting your attention on something of a choice. It's a focused attention by choice, which keeps us from just getting lost in this rumination and this internal world. It's this idea of being, out there. And it's much more correlated with calmness and with reduction of the stress response, and over time, even reduction of, like the amygdala and different areas within the brain that are involved with threat. So it's a big piece of well-being. People hate mindfulness. I don't know what your experience is, but people really dislike it when that word comes up, mindfulness or meditation, in therapies. And the way that I say this is that I think the problem is that people think that you need to just sustain attention on whatever it is you're supposed to be thinking about or being mindful or meditating about. And nobody can do that. And so they just give up because really our attention span lasts like 7 seconds or something. So nobody is going to be able to just be really great at mindfulness. So if they don't really get why they should be doing this, and then they're bad at it anyway, nobody's going to do it. Like it's just so we really have to work with helping people understand. Now, your mind's supposed to shift, it's supposed to move. And it's really interesting over time, you'll start to watch where it's shifting to and what kind of habits you have in your thought processes that maybe you haven't noticed before. But the idea is when your mind shifts, and it will, and when it does, we just notice. And whenever we notice, we could be 2 minutes down some kind of rabbit hole in our mind. But as soon as we do notice, we release that thought and bring it back. The releasing of the thoughts is a skill. When we're threatened, when we're upset about something, we have this incredible tendency to want to focus on it and to spend more time with it or to problem solve it. And a lot of times we find out we've been doing that and we've been doing it for hours and we've tried 30 different times to problem solve it. There is nothing, but we're still drawn to that. The skill of learning how to let that go, just non-judgmentally, just let it go and return to what we're focused on. It has big impact on, again, not that keeping that whole system heightened again. We're just focusing on what we feel, what we see, what we hear, what our body's doing, or a thought or a mantra or a candle flame or a raisin. There's all kinds of different things that people have put forward for objects of meditation and mindfulness.
And again, Abby, you explained that so well, because I think some people come with the traditional idea it's sitting down cross-legged, listening to a to a meditation, and that is mindfulness. And also I've heard comments of people, oh well, so do it for 45 minutes a day, which of course just sets up the expectations.
Yes.
Whereas I
Yes.
think you're just explaining something very beautifully, a very natural process of understanding what our minds do, accepting what our minds do, and in that moment, just sort of like non-judgmentally coming back to the present moment.
And
So
gentle redirection,
yeah.
and learning that is a skill. So
Mm,
it will take time. So I talk to people about formal and informal practice. So the formal
yes.
practice is that sitting down and doing that. 45 minutes is, who has time for that? But
Yeah.
you might have 10, you
Yeah.
know, 10 minutes is possible. And again, a really good thing to do as part of like an association builds routine to maybe get ready for bed, to start to build a habit where this little practice starts to wind down the system, is associated with you going into your bedroom, and you can start to build on that. So it's a bringing down the system, getting ready for sleep. But informal practice is whenever you think of it.
Mm.
And that counts. That counts. Anytime you think of it, actually, I can just spend 1 minute just really focusing on what it feels like to be on my seat, on this seat, and what this feels like. And just, I'm going to notice my thoughts and bring it back my attention here. And I'm just going to practice this for a minute or two. I also tell people to practice mindfulness, which is being very focused on what's happening around you in the present. Do that when driving, because we should all be doing that when driving. Well, that's a great time to do it. Really focus on what's going on around you when you're driving. Practice mindfulness then.
And a very good point about mindfulness. I know there's mindfulness activity, isn't there? And there's mindfulness of pleasant experience as well.
Yeah.
And the
Mhm.
mindfulness, you can sort of do practice mindfulness when you're washing up or when you're driving and things like that. And oh, right, okay, well that's much easier to do. And so it's starting people on a success place where they can do it. And yeah, but I love that. It's a very good time to actually practice mindfulness when you're driving. Yeah, the people who drive, who can all do that, can't we? And that's very wise words. That's
Yeah, because if you think about how much time we actually spend in our own default mode network when we're driving, really just reflecting and thinking through internally, and we're highly distracted because
mm,
we're somewhere
yeah.
else.
Just a question about the default mode, because what I hear a lot of clients say to me is when they're trying to go to sleep,
Mhm.
that's when the mind seems to really go into this. I think it is this default
Yeah.
mode you're talking about. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. It is. It's, it's where the brain kind of goes when there isn't a lot of stimulation that it needs to be processing. And yes, that's one of the biggest difficulties and one of the, primary presentations of a lot of people coming into therapy is struggling to turn those thoughts off. And that's not the right way to talk about it, because we talk about turning off thoughts, which we can't do, but we can direct attention. So what we practice over time is that skill of doing things where we focus our attention, particularly, I say, going to sleep, working with the body is a really great way to do, because when you are focused on what your body is doing, a deep breathing, long breaths out for the parasympathetic nervous system, the breathing out is the particularly important piece. Getting into rhythm, noticing where your body is, going through progressive muscle relaxation of just clenching and relaxing different muscles systematically throughout the body, but noticing where, when you are spending time focusing on what your body and your breathing is doing in the moment, one of the things I love to do is just to feel and really engage in the feeling of the covers, the real warmth and the associative
Yeah.
experience of pleasure of just being there, knowing I have lots of time before I have to get up again, and just truly engaging in that lovely sensory experience. I'm focusing my attention on what's happening here and now. I am not ruminating about that meeting that I have and what I need to do tomorrow.
Mm.
So when my mind goes there, and it will, I work on bringing it back into the covers and my breathing, my body. And, again, this is not going to be just, people who've really struggled aren't going to go home and try this and go, oh, that's amazing. I just, but it's a process of retraining the brain that going to sleep and having some quiet time is not the time to now catastrophize, because that's what it would have been, doing this whole time to associate. So that's an unlearning process with neuroplasticity and habit change. And it takes a lot of continuing and working on it over time.
And you mentioned earlier on, but I think this is a really good point. You talk about bottom down and bottom up
Uh-huh.
kind of practices,
Yeah.
and I think what you're saying is the focusing on the snuggling in the duvet section is sort of like an embodied experience, and that in itself calms the mind. Have I got that correct? Is that what you're meaning?
Absolutely. I mean, our mind is interpreting our body signals all the time. And a lot of times our mind is trying to make sense of that. And when we're consciously making sense of what our body is doing, emotion is nothing more than a state of our physical body and our needs. And our consciousness then makes all kinds of interpretations around that. And so it's just one way to think about not giving additional upsetting or anxiety producing emotion states for the brain to have to interpret and cope and work with, if we are really soothing that body system. If we're working at least on that bit of getting into the relaxation response, we are much more in a position to potentially go into sleep than if we're in that heightened stress state and our body's feeling all of this. Because if our body's feeling all of that stress, it's giving us a reaction, and a cortisol or adrenaline, which is all about energy and all about getting us out of a difficult situation and gets our heartbeat. That's so far from what we need to get into sleep. Yeah, that's what a lot of us do at night when we have the time to finally ruminate over some problem or concern or some fear in the future. It's quiet, and now's the time. And that's completely different from what we really want.
Mm, yeah. And again, very well explained. And I think if people understand that, they think, okay, there's something I can do about this. And I think you're also saying it's a process as well, which is really good to hear, that, it's okay not to get it right. Because then people think, I've failed, I
Yeah.
can't do it. And then therefore they get the stress response again as well, because I'm not doing it well enough or properly, I'm failing. And that can create that sort of rumination and those sort of negative feelings as well.
That's
Yeah.
why I'm always saying this is a skill. If you think about skills, if you pick up woodworking, you're not going to build a beautiful table. You'll, build like a stick at first, and then you just develop it over time. But if you give up after that first, well, my table doesn't look much like a table, and then you give up, well, then, that's going to be where this problem is. If we are so self-critical, and
Yeah.
so the truth is, sometimes people are just desperate, and that desperation then feels like everything is just impossible and they have a huge mountain to climb. But the best that we can be saying is that these are techniques that they're scientifically backed. There's reason to believe that they are efficient and effective for everybody. But you may be in a different place in your journey of how you can adopt these things. So it's just a little bit at a time. And maybe the sleep thing isn't something you can start with, but maybe the moving your body might be. You might be able to incorporate that more into the requirements of the rest of your life. And if so, well, maybe that can be helped with sleep, because you start to use more energy and you get tired again. So that might be a first step. So there's different ways. And I think that's what therapy often does. It really works to help personalize a plan for the individual about where are they getting stuck? Where are their hurdles? Is this something to do with their interactions with their mind, with the way their mind works, with things that they haven't observed or understood? Is it their ability to understand emotions or to cope or to tolerate them? Is it an excessive need to have soothing habits that are potentially, interfering ones? Is it about their interpersonal relationships? Is it about, just learning some strategies about mind, body, and which one? Where do we start? And it's not going to be the same for everybody, which is why I really hate those like 5 tips for curing your anxiety, because that is it sets everybody up for feeling like, well, it didn't work for me, it seems to work for everybody else, and very unhelpful.
And I know clients who sort of brought 5 books on anxiety, and just been left confused as well, because the overwhelm. I'm trying so hard to understand my anxiety, and why
Yeah.
can't I understand it? And I think you just made a really good point about this default mode. And I think what happens, I think sometimes with some individuals, is that the default mode is accessed more quickly. This sort of feeling of I've failed and I've got it wrong again, and here we go again. This is the story of my life. I am a failure. Sort of gets in the way of that kind of building up these skills and seeing them as skills and things that they can do something about. Would that be fair to say, Amber, in your
Yeah,
experience?
yeah, absolutely. And that would be then potentially part of what, therapy would be looking at. We'd be talking about what we call self-limiting beliefs. So actually, maybe the first step is not dealing with sleep. It might be the first step, thinking about what our mind is saying to us. Everything that we think is not true. But that's a very, very tricky concept. In theory, it seems like everything our mind says is based off of all of our knowledge and experience and wisdom. And then only later do we start to say, actually, we maybe need to have a different relationship between what's authentically us and what the mind is doing and what it's trying to do and why. Again, there's always going to be good reasons for it, but there will be more unhelpful things that it says and does, often to protect us in some
Yeah.
way, versus things that are really moving us towards our own goals and values.
Yeah. There's a quite a quote I quite like, which says, "My mind is not always my friend," and I think that
Absolutely.
summarizes what you're saying very well.
Absolutely.
So, Amber, it's been such an amazing privilege to have you on my podcast, and thank you so much for your amazing wisdom and your explanation in very easy to understand terms of this very complicated machine that we live in. And so, thank you so much. And I
Oh,
know
it's my
you have
pleasure.
you've got an ebook and you've got some other resources on your website. So, could you tell us a little bit more about your ebook and also just give out the contact details so people who want to know more about your practice and what you do that they can contact you?
Sure, sure. We can be found at www.healthymindpsychology.co.uk. And that is a practice. I have over 25 other doctoral level psychologists that work with us, and we really work across the mind-body link and have a whole host of different specialties. So if anybody is thinking about whether or not it's time to start to engage with somebody and come over some of the habits or hurdles, by all means, please reach out and we can see if we can help. We do a lot of online work. But also on the website, we have a whole area for resources. And in that, I have just things that I like to put out there. I have a book of the month, different things that I've read over time that I want to share with people. We have blogs of the month, and we have freebies, which are different things that we've developed that are, again, completely free to access that just help with, kind of workbook kind of things, just a few pages each time of all different types of topics there. But that might just be able to help you start thinking and reflecting, or putting something down on paper that can help you think in a different way. And then we have an ebook for purchase, which is all about people suffering with pain, which is a topic we didn't really get into. But again, the mind-body connection is really important. In pain, in particular, chronic pain conditions, there are so many hurtful, unhelpful messages out there that are often blaming and shaming, that make people feel very lost. And it's all part of kind of a medical culture that we still have too. But as hopefully the listeners have really got a feel for today, the brain cannot be taken out of the whole equation. And what the brain is doing is all about interpretation of what's happening in the body. But that does not mean that pain is in your head. I mean, well, pain's in your head the same way that hunger's in your head. It's still a very real experience, but it's nothing more than an interpretation of body signals that gives us an explanation of what's going on so we know what to do next. And in that way, I think we go through a much more detailed explanation that helps people understand their conditions, particularly when they don't feel like there's much further track in the medical world. And gives them maybe some other ideas of how to not just cope and manage, but maybe even start to alter those signals to live better longer. So that's on the website too. But again, that was my little pain spiel. We didn't get to that one.
Yes, yes. Had in my head is that maybe another time you could come back and talk about pain because I
Sure.
didn't want to do a disservice to your amazing knowledge in pain and like you say, there's a whole complete subject around pain. But thank you so much for mentioning that workbook because and that could be a good start for people to actually
Absolutely.
feel that they've got something they can work towards.
Yeah. And we're also on Instagram as well. So I'll put that one is at Healthy
Oh
Mind
yeah.
Psychology UK. And that too, if you're just wanting a little bit of fun and you're scrolling for your dopamine fix, then, might as
Yeah.
well
And
come.
just to mention to the listeners is that all those details will be put on the show notes. So if you didn't get time to write it down, you can actually go to the show notes and actually get those details from Amber. So Amber, you have been an amazing guest, and thank you so much for the wisdom, the knowledge, and the dedication you have given in your life to actually develop these skills and to bring that extra understanding, that extra sort of special ingredient really to really understand the mind and the body connection in a way which people can actually have hope that they can actually make changes and change is possible. So thank you so much for
Thank
being
you for
a guest.
having me. It's been a pleasure.